and I saw the Lord. It was when Uzziah dies and Isaiah's world is unraveling that he saw God. Uzziah was the king. The king died. But then he saw the Lord sitting on a throne. Where does a king sit? On a throne. Well, a king died. The king was fine. Because he saw God sitting on the throne, even though the human king died. I saw him. Notice, he saw him sitting on a throne. Now, Isaiah is a prophet. He's a representative of God, but he's going to see God like he has never seen him before in the midst of a disappointment. Some of your greatest experiences with God are going to come in your lowest points of life. Some of your greatest encounters with God is going to come at some of your lowest points in life. So in your lowest point in life, when you are struggling with life, look for God, because he's still sitting on the throne. He went on to say his robe filled the temple. Now, let's say this is a wedding. There were no seats. It was just the floor. The bride came in and her train of her dress filled the temple, filled the sanctuary. So that'd be a huge train. So the train is, the flowing part that comes off the gown. Well, the king's train, his robe, filled the temple. Well, let's say you were coming to the wedding and she has already walked in, but her robe is filling the temple. Well, now you have a problem. Because if her robe is filling the temple, then there's no way for you to come in without stepping on her train, because it's filling the temple. In other words, her presence is all consuming. So you got to be careful how you walk. And you got to be careful how dirty your shoes are. What did God tell Moses? Take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. You got tiptoe. You got to be real careful now if the train is filling the temple. He said he saw angels, seraphim, above him, because they weren't going to step on the king's robe, having 6 wings. With 2, they covered their face because they could not stare directly on the glory of God. With 2, he covered his feet because they couldn't step on the robe of God. And with 2, they did fly because they were carrying out the will of God. So they're in worship like we were. They're singing antiphonally. Verse 3, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Now watch this. His robe is filling where? The temple. But his glory is filling where? The whole earth. So God never expects his glory to be limited to the church. He wants to fill the church, but he wants it to overflow to the earth. That's why you just can't be a Christian in church. You're supposed to fill every place of the earth. When Christ physically comes back, he's going to do that. In the meantime, we are his body. We're to carry his glory out of the temple into the world because his glory fills the whole earth. There is no place on planet earth where God's glory is not meant to fill. Now, the word holy can often get confused with the word righteous or righteousness. When we talk about righteousness, we're talking about the divine standard, the standard of God, his law, his principles, his commands, his standards. That's his righteousness. But remember, holiness is a broader concept, and it affects all of his characteristics or attributes. Okay, so if you want a synonym for holy, it is uniqueness. Now, there are a number of words that come off of the word holy that are synonyms. Sacred, okay, is another synonym for holy. It means to be set apart, unique, one of a kind, class by itself. So God is not to be treated as common. Certainly he's not to be treated as profane, but not even as regular. He's not one of. That's why he would not allow any other idols. He's not just another God. He is in a class by himself. That is, he is distinct in all of his perfections. Isaiah 57:15 says, holy is his name. Psalm 89:35, God swears by his holiness. God's holiness involves his purity, his separateness from anything that's unlike him. Now, we may think God is too picky, but if you're going into an operating room, you want your doctor to be picky. You certainly don't want him digging his scalpel in the mud and cutting you with it. But you don't want him sneezing on it either. So you want him to be real particular with you. Well, if a doctor has to be particular with you, what about a God who has a perfect standard? So when we talk about this holiness, separateness, it's a class by itself. It is unique. So you see, the angels are lifting God up. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. And there's nowhere on the planet you can go where you don't run into him. The whole earth is full of his glory. The only reason we don't run into him more is man has gotten in the way. We have built ourselves distractions from his glory, or we have made us our own glory. So we don't see his glory. But the earth is full of his glory. That is, you can't do anything that does not in some way bump into God. The word glory means to advertise or display, to put on advertisement. God is advertised everywhere, in everything is the advertisement of God. But if you're not conscious of it, if you're not looking for it, if you're not thinking that way, you'll miss it, or you'll dumb it down. When you have a beautiful day, that's God's day. It only rains because of God. It only snows because of God. The wind only blows because of God. In fact, you breathing because of God. That's why evolution is a religion, because it wants you to define things in life apart from God. It's not only about how the earth was created, it is also how the earth is sustained. Evolution says it was created without God and it's sustained without God. In other words, what evolution is doing is trying to rip the glory of God away from him and put it in the hands of man, better known as science. All science is supposed to be is finding out how God does what he does. Science has become replacing God with man. So the whole earth is full of his glory. And when you look at earth from this standpoint of the glory of God, then he is unique because you don't know anybody who can do what he does. He's in a class by himself. When he saw the glory of God and his uniqueness in the sanctuary, our job is to keep you, keep me, keep us God-focused and God-centered. Now, in the Lord's Prayer, we're learning that this God is also your Father. So he wants a relationship. But he's looking at scope now. The earth is full of his glory. In the sanctuary, in the church house, the temple, we are to remind you and us to maintain and to keep a God-centered focus in all of life, since the earth is full of his glory. So we want you to run into God from the time you get up to the time you go to bed. And when you wake up, you start all over again. And if you have to, dream about him. Okay? In other words, this comprehensive view of God, and to begin to look for him everywhere. because the earth is full of his glory. Now, when they're getting their praise on, it says the foundation of the threshold trembled at the voice of him who called out while the temple was filling with smoke. Now you talk about a church service. The place was shaken by the glory of God, or by the praise of the glory of God. As the angels were worshiping, the building shook. There are numbers of times, 2 Chronicles 5, but they're having this worship service, and they're just worshiping and making a big deal about God. And it says, and the glory of God came and invaded the place so that the minister could not get up to minister. Because who needs a sermon when God shows up? That is the sermon. Okay? So let's make a big deal about God in your life, in your world, in your focus comprehensively, since the earth is full of his glory. So, he's hearing this celebration of God by the angels. Then I said, uh-oh, woe is me, for I am ruined, I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips. Now, he's the preacher, he's the prophet. And he says, I'm a man of unclean lips. He goes on to say, and I am among a people of unclean lips. Wait a minute, you didn't know your lips were unclean? Look at the last line of verse 5. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. When you see God, you see yourself better. See, as long as you're being defined by people, you may look better than you really are. But when you've seen the King, because you have exalted his holiness above all else, his uniqueness, you become exposed. He says, Isaiah, you've been preaching, but you ain't been, your lips aren't where they need to be. So he sees himself. He sees his failure. He sees his weakness. He sees where he hasn't lived up to it because he's measuring himself against the right standard. When non-believers stand before God, some non-believers will be a lot better than other non-believers in how they live their lives. But that's not the standard. God says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. In other words, God is the standard. So being better than your neighbor makes you a better person on earth. It still doesn't meet the standard of God. That's why we need Jesus Christ, who met the standard of God. So he sees himself. Now, it's a bad thing for a good reason. When God exposes you to you, when he lets you see a part of you that's not pretty, we can be comfortable with our mess. We can get comfortable, especially if we don't think it's that bad or everybody else is there doing it, you know. But God's glory shows you what's wrong with you and shows you what's wrong with everybody you know. He says you are a people of unclean lips. You run in your mouth and they run in their mouth. And all y'all wrong. Because I'm looking at a different standard. I'm looking at God. Then when he recognized what was wrong with him.